One of the features of our lives, a feature that has come to be an integral part of what we call leading the good life, is travel. However, travel, as we mean it, is a relatively modern idea, as I hope to show this afternoon. Now, it's not that people didn't visit foreign lands before the modern era. Of course they did, but it usually came about through a military campaign, a religious pilgrimage, or through some commercial exploratory venture, such as Columbus going towards India, all of which entailed the encounter with new lands and peoples. Conquest, the hope of heavenly reward, or material gain were the ends. Travel was the means. The expectation that we now have is that when we go from point A to point B, when we remove ourselves from the familiarity of one place to be transported to the unknown shores of another location, we do so with the hope that we will be enriched with knowledge of exotic locales, new manners and dress, unusual foods and climes, and other notions of beauty, both artistic and topographical. But, to repeat, this idea of travel as both recreational and educational is fairly new in the history of the West, and it begins with what we call the Grand Tour of the 18th century. What was grand about the tour we're about to talk about? Well, for one thing, the people who embarked on it were themselves pretty grand. They were, without exception, aristocrats, and for our purposes, they were British. British for the simple reason that they were by far the most numerous travelers, and the consequences of their travels were to affect British life and culture in the most profound ways. And invariably, they were male, many having just completed their education at Oxford or Cambridge. What their tour was about Italy, above all. For it was there that the remnants of the ancient world, of the Greeks and Romans, could be best seen and collected. We must remember that since Tudor times, the literature and philosophy of antiquity, especially Roman, was the core of a high-born gentleman's education. The works of Horace, Ovid, Cicero, as well as Greek authors were found in every library. And almost without exception, the owner would be able to read it in the original Latin, and most could even handle Greek. Familiarity with ancient literature was a given. Knowledge of ancient art, however, was not. It was not until the Stuart dynasty at the beginning of the 17th century that we begin to see the emergence of the art collector of antique things. Now, what I'm showing you here on the screen is two portraits by Lynn Matteson of the second Earl and Countess of Arundel, who was a courtier of both the early James I, towards the end part of his career, and of Charles I. He was a Catholic, and for that reason, one of the reasons, but his interest in Italy was twofold. One, he had antiquarian interests, but also Italy was a focus of pilgrimage, so he often would go to Rome for religious reasons. But while there, he would collect ancient sculpture, especially he was attracted to. He is here shown on his left, pointing to the statues in his art gallery. Some of these can be identified, they still exist. And over on the right, the Countess, who the floor below is sitting in front of the painting gallery. They collected painting. Of course, there isn't much ancient painting to speak of. Their collections dealt with basically, again, Italian for the most part, Titians, Tintorettos, Bellinis. They tried to get Raphaels and things of that sort. The Earl of Arundel went on a trip to Italy in the 1600s, and he took with him a young protege by the name of Inigo Jones, who became an architect. Inigo Jones became fascinated with the new style, and new for him was the Italian Renaissance style of architecture that we know of. He came back full of these ideas from Italy, and Charles I, who was now king, sort of borrowed him from Arundel and commissioned Jones to build the banqueting house, which is a building done in the style that was absolutely radical for the English at this time. It's a style which is based entirely on Italian models. You have the use of the classical orders. As you can see, these pilasters in the iconic style. Windows which alternate between a segmented arch and a pyramidal arch. And the second story, which is more elaborate, as the usual vocabulary in this kind of thing, is that you go from simple orders to more elaborate orders. So you go from Ionic to the very elaborate Corinthian with swags in between the bays, and then finally an Attic story up here, a balustrade. All of this is meant to represent the new style as it was being articulated in Italy. It was a style which was utterly new to the English. You note the date is 1619. This was being built in 1627, and this is the style that more or less one associates with the Jacobean period of this time. There's nothing in here that talks of the Italians. Yes, you do have a symmetrical layout, but there's no sense of orders. You use brick, which instead of the marble that we have over here, or something that attempts to be marble, that's the impression it wants to give you. And basically what we have here on the left with Inigo Jones is a style which, for the critics of Charles I, encapsulated absolutely perfectly what they objected to him. It is Italian, i.e. foreign. It is Italian, i.e. Catholic. It is associated with classical antiquity, i.e. pagan as well. It is a house which was built for, not banqueting necessarily, but for masques. Those are sort of the form of art that was just prior to the opera, where there was music and dancing and high costumes. And it was painted, the ceiling of the inside was decorated with the pictures of Rubens, who himself was an ambassador from the court of Spain, an ardent Catholic, as well as being one of the most popular and important painters of the day. So it is no wonder that when ultimately Charles I was executed, that his accusers built the scaffold for his execution outside this window. And it is there that he was executed. The period between, say, the execution of Charles I in 1649 and the period where we now take up this grand tour, the context with Italy became broken, partly because of the Civil War and the puritanical culture that took place well into the 1660s, but also because of the continent was itself enmeshed in many wars, the War of the Spanish Succession, etc. And finally, in 1713, there was a treaty, this Treaty of Utrecht, which settled all this. Then the continent was open for travel, and that, together with the recent discoveries of Pompeii and Herculaneum in the 1730s, the rush to Italy began in true earnest. This is a picture of one of our typical aristocrats who are going on their tour. William Coke, the Earl of Leicester. He's painted by Pompeo Battoni, who became the kind of, if you remember, I'm sure some of you in this audience will remember, the photographer Karsh. Well, if you were anybody, you had to have your photograph by Karsh. The same with Battoni. If you were in Italy, you had to have your picture painted by Battoni. And of the 225 portraits by Battoni, 175 are of Englishmen or Britons. So that tells you, one, that was true, and two, the real preponderant number of Britons in Italy at this, traveling to Italy. The formula that we see here is pretty much what will be standard. The nonchalant attitude, the very easy elegance of the figure. He is in a kind of loggia with the Italian countryside in the background. He's leaning on the statue, which is an echo of an Italian monument, in fact. It is an echo of a statue that was in the Vatican collections. Goes under various names, Sleeping Ariadne or Cleopatra. It's a Hellenistic sculpture from the 3rd century BC. I forgot to mention that every one of his friends knew that the face on our statue was actually the face of his girlfriend. Another painting, this time a young man with the monuments of Rome in the background, Hadrian's tomb or Castel San Angelo on the left, and on the right, St. Peter's. He leans against a plinth with a sculpted figure. This can also be identified in the Vatican collection. This is in the Los Angeles County Museum, and it's a picture that Winckelmann, who was the leader of this cult of antiquity in Italy, thought was probably the best portrait in the world at the time. And there's probably a good reason, because it is based on the Apollo Belvedere, which is also in the Vatican collection. You can see the way the stance is, the outstretched arm, the turn of the head. all of this, trying to enunciate this sculptural model. And then some of them didn't know where they were once they arrived. This is a man who forgot to dress appropriately, so he brings his Gordon tartan, and this is the way he's going to have himself painted. But he is standing before a personification of Rome with, I think this is the Colosseum or the markets of Trajan in the background. Well, what was their itinerary? You would leave from Dover, cross the Channel to Calais, travel to Paris, and hoop-de-doo there, continue on your trip through Lyon, and either went through Switzerland or down to Marseille, where you would take a boat from Marseille to Leghorn, or one of the other towns along the coast. This was not the preferred way because it was so dangerous crossing this particular spot, but they did do it. To go from this coast over this way along the coast was impassable. The roads just didn't exist. Oddly enough, one of the most popular ways was to cross the Alps and to enter Italy from the north, arriving in Turin or Milan, and then work your way down the continent. If you took the Swiss route, it was an arduous trip. First of all, let me just say that this was arduous for several reasons. First of all, the means of travel had been unchanged for thousands of years. It was horse and carriage, or by sea, and your trip was not just a weekend jaunt, but minimum a year, usually 2, and as many as 7. If you came back. Some decided to stay, usually for reasons that they couldn't go back, actually. If you travel the Swiss route, you would very often have to have your carriage disassembled and you be carried by chaise lounge across the treacherous Alps, and then your carriage would be reassembled as well. This was a journey that attracted a lot of men very often. They rather enjoyed the danger of this kind of journey. I'm showing you a late picture, 1803 by Turner, one of these crossings where he does capture the massiveness of the chasms and precipices of the cliffs and the sheer danger of crossing a small bridge. This idea of enjoying the danger, of really seeking the frisson of death, was encapsulated by a poet. Thomas Gray is the poet, a very famous 18th century poet, who wrote in a letter to one of his friends about his trip. He said, "Not a precipice, not a torrent, not a cliff, but is pregnant with religion and poetry. There are certain scenes that would awe an atheist into belief. Without the help of other argument, you have death perpetually before your eyes." And also there was the sheer grandeur of some of the alpine scenes, as you can see this in this watercolor by a Frenchman by the name of Ducrot, and 2 watercolors by a rather famous watercolors by the name of John Robert Cousins. Cousins is interesting. As you can see, he was a consummate watercolorist. He was the painting master to a rather wealthy man. And when this man, William Beckford, decided to take his Italian journey, Beckford, to give you some background, was probably the wealthiest man in England. His teacher in music was Mozart for a few weeks, and his painting instructor was Cousins. And when he left to go on his travels, he brought his entire entourage, not Mozart, but Cousins, who would then paint what he told them to paint and have a tutor to explain what in fact he was seeing, and this was a very common part of the entourage. Of course, the valet and all the rest of it. Cousins painted these magnificent pictures of the Alps, and one of the attractions of the Alps, and the reasons why they decided to go in that particular journey, was to see the magnificence of the mountains. Remember, England, or Great Britain, the highest mountain in all of the British Isle is Ben Nevis, which is 4,100 feet. To see something, in the 13,000 foot range is, of course, was something to behold. Finally, you hit Italy, and you go the normal route. You hit Pisa, you hit Siena, and then finally you hit Florence. And here you see a panoramic view of Florence from the hill above. There is the cathedral, there's the Palazzo della Signoria, and the various other monuments you can barely see in this slide. Thomas Patch was a resident of visiting compatriots. This looks like a high-end garage sale, but it's what it is, it's a room in the Uffizi Gallery called the Tribuna, and it was a gallery where the Grand Duke of Tuscany had assembled his art collection. And what we have here is a group of these English connoisseurs sort of milling about, examining and looking at the various masterpieces that was in the Duke's collection. Well, here's a Raphael, a very famous Raphael, another Raphael, the Golden, the Madonna of the Canary, a Rubens up here, and various other painters. Mind you, the other thing to think about is that this artist who is painting it, Zoffany, is imitating with really extraordinary precision the different styles of each artist, which is a feat in itself. Here is Titian's Venus of Urbino, and with admiring friends, looking at her with some lasciviousness. And over here, you can barely make him out. There is the artist who is holding up another Raphael amongst these other connoisseurs. And then, of course, there are some of the ancient statues which were part of the Duke's collection. Finally, we approach Rome. Two views of Rome, one by Richard Wilson, an English painter who lived in Rome a number of years and adopted that wonderful sort of classical landscape style that you see over here, where you have these balancing masses on the left and right, the open center, the vista into the depth, and the landmarks punctuating the far space. Here you see St. Peter's, and as you can see, it's empty, it's all fields all around it. From the one below, from Panini, who is one of these resident Roman painters who painted for this international trade that visited Rome, view of Rome from the north. And here you see Hadrian's tomb, St. Peter's off to the right. This is the church which is on the very top of the Spanish Steps, San Maria del Monte. And again, the fields, which were then Rome. If you came from the north, and which of course you did, you would come through this particular gate, the Porta del Popolo, which leads on to the Piazza del Popolo, which I'll show you in a moment. It's a very interesting monument in Rome. As you can see, this side of the gate is designed by Michelangelo. If you go on the other side and look back, you'll see that it's been designed by Bernini 100 years later. So it's really a sort of a marvelous sort of screen that has two different histories. I'm showing you a picture on the right of Goethe by Johann Tischbein, another German who was resident in Rome. Goethe visited Rome in 1786. His book, his diary of that journey, it remains one of the best monuments of that particular experience to have survived. But what he says as he entered Rome, he's not in the Porta del Popolo right this moment. I'll come back to that image in another way. But he writes in his diary, he says, "Even to myself, I hardly dared admit where I was going, and all the way I was still afraid I might be dreaming. It was not until I passed through the Porta del Popolo that I was certain that I was in Rome. Now, at last, I have arrived in the first city in the world. Had I seen it 15 years ago, I should have called myself lucky. But since I was destined to visit it alone and trust to my own eyes, I am happy at least to have been granted this joy so late in life." And interestingly, he's dressed in a kind of pilgrimage. This would be a code for a pilgrim's outfit, not a pious pilgrim, not a Christian pilgrim, a Greek pilgrim, actually. That's the kind of dress that they would wear. And that's very consciously worn here as a kind of homage to the culture that he was pursuing. You would walk through the gates. This is the Piazza del Popolo, the three streets that run into the piazza, the Via Bambuino, the Corso, and the Via Ripetta on the right-hand side, and the two churches, I forget their names, and this obelisk. And you would arrive just down the street. If you had taken the Via Bambuina this way, you would end up at the Piazza di Spagna. And this is a drawing of the Englishmen arriving at the Piazza di Spagna during Carnival, which was a big deal in Rome well into the 19th century. You don't hear about it so much. You hear about Venice Carnival, but Rome had a very elaborate carnival festivities. And here, the Piazza di Spagna was, in fact, where a lot of the international colony, but especially the English, came to stay. Here is the famous Café degli Inglesi, which was decorated, in fact, by Piranesi. It was the coffee shop where all the English and many of the Germans and Swedes also hung out. And over here was a hotel, Villa de Londres, again, advertising itself in French for the English. And then a man who is getting out of his carriage being accosted by all the frivolities that are taking place in the square, in the piazza. Of course, British were tourists like everyone else, and here we see them just going around looking at the various monuments, the Arch of Constantine, the Colosseum. And over on the right, a painting by Sir Joshua Reynolds called the Modern School of Athens. One of the things, of course, that they went to see, not the principal thing, but one of the things that they saw in Rome, after all their quest was primarily for antiquities, were the paintings that could be found by Raphael and Michelangelo in the Vatican, in the royal apartments. And this was one of them, Raphael's famous School of Athens. And Sir Joshua parodies this image. Instead of having, as Raphael has done, his protagonists being the various heroes that come from antiquity, from ancient Greece, such as Pythagoras over here, Euclid over here, Plato and Aristotle in the center. He gets his buddies from London who are visiting, and he puts them in their respective positions, but in a cartoonish style, as you can see with the dog, of course, which Raphael, of course, would not permit to be in that. And then you have the other places of Rome to visit, the Piazza del Pantheon, the interior of the Pantheon, by Panini, Piranesi's. I'm giving you these views by the people who were making the views at the time and selling them to the English. The Piranesi's became very highly sought after by the English clientele. This is a painting that is done by Joseph Rite of Derby, an Englishman from Derbyshire, the Central Midlands of England, who is looking at the festival at the carnival that they used to have. See how elaborate it was. Here is the fireworks going off Castel San Angelo, and St. Peter's in the background, illuminated by candles, if you can imagine. And over here, he writes in an enthusiastic letter to his friend what in fact he is seeing, including the draft, a sketch of this view, a view which was repeated endlessly throughout, even until the 19th century. And then, of course, visiting St. Peter's and the Roman Forum. Now, I'm showing you the Roman Forum because aside, it shows you what it looked like then. Those of you who've been to Rome know it doesn't look like this any longer. Down here it says Foro de Vacchio. What that means is the forum for the cows. It used to be a sort of a grazing field until the archaeologists began to take over, and that's what it was called in the 18th century. But it was here in the Forum that Edward Gibbon was inspired to begin his history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Now let me just give you a quote of this because it's an interesting thing. I can neither forget nor express the strong emotions which agitated my mind as I first approached and entered the Eternal City, the same idea that we got from Goethe. After a sleepless night, I trod with a lofty step the ruins of the Forum, each memorable spot where Romulus stood or Tully spoke or Caesar fell, was at once present to my eye, and several days of intoxication were lost or enjoyed before I could descend to a cool and minute investigation. It was at Rome on the 15th of October, 1764, anniversary is coming up, as I sat musing amidst the ruins of the Capitol, while the barefooted friars were singing vespers in the Temple of Jupiter, that the idea of writing the decline and fall of the city first started in my mind. And it did begin as a history of the city of Rome, and then was expanded into 6 volumes to become the fall and decline of the empire. Now, Rome, we had its attractions and was the principal point of our tourist journey. But the countryside south of Rome to Naples was almost as important. There was an area called the Campagna. You can see even this title tells you how important it was as a place to go, because Goethe is in the Campagna. And he is in a landscape which has littered the ruins of antiquity. And it is a certain kind of landscape, smooth with some bordering hills, but a classically balanced landscape which is used over and over again from as early as the 17th century by the French artist Claude Lorrain, who spent most of his life in Rome, painted mostly pictures of this sort. 130 years later, a same formula of landscape composition by our friend Cousins. The object to go through the Campagna was not only to see the countryside, but to visit Naples, partly because of the ruins that were there, that were lately being excavated at Pompeii and Herculaneum. And I'm showing you a picture done from about the 1760s of the excavations that were taking place outside of Naples. And of course, Vesuvius. And Joseph Wright of Derby, an artist as you might have expected from that picture of Rome that I showed you where Hadrian's tomb is blowing up, was attracted to these sort of apocalyptic and sublime kinds of images. This is an imagined eruption of Vesuvius, and it's the destruction of the various cities in its path. And the fieriness of Vesuvius is contrasted with the eeriness of the moon as it rises above the horizon. Both Goethe and Joseph Wright of Derby climb to the top of Vesuvius, and this is a watercolor of another climb by someone else. But people did do it, and here you see them visiting it and overcoming the smell of the sulfur, I'm sure. And then there were other things to see. There was the grottos at Capri, also by Joseph Wright, and over here on the right-hand side, the Bay of Naples by Cousins. Now, the picture on the right is of particular interest. It is taken from the villa of a nobleman who was the ambassador to the court at Sicily and Naples. It was called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. The capital was in Naples, but the kingdom also comprised Sicily. The man who was the ambassador was a man by the name of Sir William Hamilton. And this is Reynolds' portrait of Sir William in his library, in his study, looking over his book, and I'll come to that in just a second, at his vases, his sculptures, the bas-reliefs, which you can't see are some gemstones up here and some little sculptures. And of course, in the background, you see Vesuvius smoking through that window. William Hamilton had amassed, in the many years that he lived in Naples, an immense collection of antiquities, both vases, gemstones, sculpture. And it was for that reason that he was visited quite often by including Goethe, who would go there. He would have also concerts, evening salons. Mozart was one of the performers, in fact. And the other attraction to visit was his wife, Emma Hamilton. Some of you may have heard of Emma Hamilton. The story is that she was a kind of theatrical personage, i.e. chorus girl, or a person of ill repute, let's put it that way, who was the mistress of Charles Grenville and lived in London with Charles Grenville, who was part of the very important Hamilton family. It's a very distinguished family of Scotland. It was coming to be the time, however, where he should marry. And of course, this liaison was proving to be somewhat embarrassing for his family. And so they urged him to please get rid of her and marry someone that we've chosen for you, more appropriate to your station. So there was a gentleman's agreement made between Charles and his uncle that she, Emma, would be passed to him. His uncle was William Hamilton. So William Hamilton takes Emma away from London, away from all the talk, and she becomes ensconced in Naples as his wife. And there she proceeded to be the hostess of this very elaborate salon that that he had established. And one of her attributes was to do performances, a kind of Agnes de Mille type dancing, and in various costumes, and she would act out various parts, not necessarily with voice, but just sort of move around in enticing manners. And she became the object of many, many portraits. You could do a whole exhibition on the portraits of Emma Hamilton. And this is another picture of her as the Three Muses. Well, to get back to Hamilton and his collection, he came up with the idea of publishing his collection, and he got a very famous artist, Tischbein, who painted that portrait of Goethe, to illustrate his collection after it had been cataloged by Baron d'Arconville. What you see here is the cover of the publication. It's a big book about this big, several volumes. Here, for instance, is a vase from his collection. This is Tischbein's engraving of it and hand-colored plate, which then became the model for a vase by Wedgwood. And this was often the case. There were many examples of this happening, where Hamilton's publication, an epic publication in its day, became the source for works of art secondarily. Here you have another example. This is a house in Sussex where the panels of this settee here are taken directly from Hamilton's publication. A particular one is a large plate which is in the folio and now blown up to be a big wall, a mural of itself. The whole room is done straight out of Hamilton's publication. So what we're seeing then is the beginning of how this art is beginning, this ancient art is beginning to affect, indeed, the works of art in England itself. Now, what did they do when they finished with their trip? Well, they went home, most of them did, and of course, being Englishmen, they formed a club. This is the members of the Dilettanti Society, a group that still exists. The club still exists. It looks like they're having a wonderful time, which they are, in fact. But before I get to some of that, they were responsible, however, for funding a couple of very important tours to Greece. I haven't mentioned Greece because Greece was not basically on the itinerary because it was so far away, and secondly, it was the part of the Ottoman Empire, which was not hospitable necessarily to foreigners. That changed over time, but at this particular point, it was rare for anyone to go into Greece. So Rome, they had to be satisfied with Rome. Here, anyway, the society did fund two expeditions, one to Greece to measure the Acropolis and to render the various monuments on the Acropolis, and another one to go into Syria to do to paint and measure the ancient buildings in Syria and the Levant. But to get back to our picture here you see Sir William in the center, pointing out one of the vases in his publication, in his book. There is the vase, and everyone toasting him, good guy, good fellow, chap, etc. This fellow, you will notice, is holding something else. He's holding a garter. And one of the things about this society is many of the pictures are sort of naughty. There are pictures, and some of the things that William collected in his things could be called pornographic, although in our day and age it's becoming more widely defined. But in those days, certainly it was sort of pornographic material, all of which was fair game for these fellows. Over here, they're looking at other things. They're drinking, of course, but they're looking at gems. That was another thing that people collected very highly, were stones, and engraved cameos became very important for these figures. The other thing that, of course, they brought back were pictures of their trip. And this is sort of a parody of this kind of idea, because these are the pictures. This is by our friend Panini, who is painting all the different monuments that Rome has to offer, plus the statues. This is the famous Laocoon, also in the Vatican collection, famous sarcophagi, etc. This is by Zoffany. One of the great collectors was Charles Townley, and here he is seen in his study in the library, and you can see it's crammed full of antiquities that he brought back. He was a Catholic and made many visits to Italy for various reasons, but he always brought things back with him. Here we have d'Arconville, who is the cataloger of the Hamilton collection. Over here is that naughty nephew who passed Emma on to Sir William, and then another antiquarian whose name I forget right now. This is, of course, Charles Townley, because, of course, the dog identifies the owner. His dog's name is Cam. This was his residence, just crammed full of these antiquities that they brought back. And mind you can see that this woman is reading a catalog of the thing. These were open to the public on certain days, and you tip the valet or the major domo of the house so you could see and see. So these became, in effect, museums that artists could, in fact, visit, or the public. Now, as I was saying, pictures and vases and gems and sculpture were portable. You could bring them back. You could not bring back arches and colosseums and temples. So how did they go about doing this? Here you see, of course, one of the great monuments of the Roman form, the Arch of Constantine. What they did is they emulated. This is a house in Derbyshire by Robert Adam, the great 18th century Scottish architect, who uses the core of this house, of course, the Arch of Constantine on the right. You can see the four monumental gigantic orders of Corinthian, the arch in the center with two subsidiary arches on either side. This sweeping staircase is a Baroque kind of idea, but you go up the stairs, really into a kind of, about to enter into a world of a new Rome, and you enter into this hallway, which is a long rectangle that is based on the Roman basilica design. That is to say, it's a rectangular space divided into 3 aisles, 2 narrow side aisles, and 1 large nave in the center. The 2 aisles all separated by this colonnade. You can see the richness of the marble, and as you walk along, you're entering from this angle, going along towards the door, of course, and you are accompanied on your little walk by these statues, which are copies of actual Roman and Greek, and these are paintings which are copied after some Roman murals. And then you enter through the door into this room, which cannot be photographed. It's just impossible, but it's obviously a room modeled on the interior of the Pantheon. Now, I've left Venice out of our discussion because, for all practical purposes, there's really nothing in Venice of ancient art to have attracted our artists. This is not to say, well, there is a Colosseum in Verona nearby, but that's about it. This is not to say that Venice was ignored. The contacts between Venice and England go back several hundred years. And in fact, it is from the dispatches from the Venetian ambassadors in Venice that we know a lot about the court history of the Tudors and the Elizabethans and the Stuarts. They were listening to everyone, and they had spies everywhere, and it was all put together in these dispatches. They also were the objects of collectors. The paintings, as I mentioned, Titian, Tintoretto, Bellini, all these were collected assiduously in the 17th and 18th centuries. And even in the 18th century, we have a contemporary artist collected, Canaletto. I'm showing you a picture on the left-hand side, a typical picture of one of his Venetian regattas. And he goes to London. This is London on the right, and it sort of looks like Venice, frankly. He couldn't quite get that fix out of his mind. St. Paul's in the background. But by and large, there wasn't, as I say, very much of antiquity to be found in it. What they did find, however, of some classical merit was Palladio. Palladio, the architect who in the 1560s had published a whole book of his designs, and of which they could buy and of which they could visit in the round in the countryside outside of Venice. This is his very famous, and I'm just using one of many, this Villa Rotunda outside of Vicenza. And you can see that the classical temple front, a kind of cupola here, which once you go inside looks like a mini kind of Pantheon, both symmetrical plan, all very attractive. It was this particular style which became important for many of the architects of the 18th century. I'm showing you over here on the right a house by Lord Burlington, one of these aristocrats who lived for many years in Italy, who came back and built a townhouse in the outskirts of London, now it's a suburb, called Chiswick House. And it's obviously modeled on the Villa Rotunda on the left-hand side. This style became so infectious that it was, of course, adopted by our President Thomas Jefferson in Monticello. And you can see here again the same basic format, temple front, cupola, here done in an octagon, just as we have here in Chiswick House. The picture on the left gives us the garden of one of these Palladian villas. I'm not showing you the front, but for brevity's sake. It's called Stourhead, an extraordinary garden. If you're ever in England, this is the garden to see if you have to choose. It's in Wiltshire, not far from London. This is just part of the garden, but it's the most important view because you look across this landscape, which is almost like those paintings we saw earlier of the Italian Campagna, with a bridge, trees on the left, trees on the right, and in the distance, a small little Pantheon, as you can see in the background. Over on the right, a picture of a modern version of Stourhead, to show you the sort of the lineage and how it continued well into the 20th century. However, but by the time of the French Revolution, this particular taste for antique had waned. With the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, the grand tour, as I've described it, ceased. It did not resume until the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, when the American writer Washington Irving was stationed in Bordeaux, France, as the American consul. He encountered 2 young men who had just returned from their grand tour. Irving wrote to his brother that one of them, a good-hearted fellow, but not deep as a well, says he finds himself somewhat older than when he set out, but very little wiser. $2,000 out of pocket and not 2,000 cents worth of wisdom in it. In Italy, he got quote, completely sick of antiquities and would not go 100 yards to see the best of them, unquote. It's obvious that by this time of this conversation in the 1820s, the taste for the art of Greece and Rome had begun to pall. The Romantics and the Victorians found the precision, clarity, and balance of the classical style increasingly cold, sterile, inhuman, and its attachment to the heroes and gods of antiquity overbearing. Instead, our new tourists sought out the imprecision and sprawling fancifulness of Gothic architecture as the models for their country home. And they banished from their visual life the clear outlines of ancient vase painting, preferring instead the sensuous surfaces of 15th century Sienese and Florentine images. For John Ruskin, the New Rome was Venice. For Rossetti and the Pre-Raphaelites, it was Florence. The second age of the Grand Tour was about to begin, but that's another story. Thanks very much.